who we've been able to get to speak on very short notice. She's touring and speaking about the book that she's just published on Laurie Anderson. Abrams published it this year, and there are some on display. Roselee Goldberg is, of course, a leading author and critic on performance art, and probably most of you are familiar with a book that she published. What year was it? Performance Live Art since 1960. And this book is probably going to be the classic book about that kind of work. And among other things, she was a curator at the Kitchen in New York during a very important period. And she's also known Laurie Anderson personally for 25 years. And I'm sure the insights that you're able to bring to that will be extremely important. She has also worked with such amazing figures as William Burroughs, Spalding Gray, right? That is that Laurie Anderson's work that collaborates with Lou Reed, for example, and these other people. Does that involve you too? I mean, or not really? Not really, just as a writer. Even though you've known her for 25 years, you were not part of those earlier collaborations, right? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, we look forward to the presentation that she calls a tribute to Laurie Anderson. Please welcome Roselee Goldberg.
How do we do this?
Yeah.
That's it? Flip it. Thanks. Okay. I think I'm wired. Does that work? Anyway, it's great to be here. I'm going to tell a slightly, quite a personal story about Laurie because I have known her all these years and followed her, not quite pen in hand, but I have a very good memory. And in fact, when I finally showed her the book, she read it carefully and, amongst other things, said, "Did I really say that? I completely forgot. You know, thank goodness you were there to catch it." So it's an interesting way to deal with this kind of material. Since I teach at NYU, I'm used to student format. So other than bringing out your breakfast, which is what we have to contend with at NYU because class starts at 9 o'clock, please interrupt if you want to talk about things or there's something you specifically want to talk about. It's interesting, again, would be very intrigued, and I hope there'll be time afterwards to hear your thoughts about Laurie Anderson or where she fits in your idea about the art world, because for us, I think 70s, 80s, and 90s, certainly in the early 70s, she was such a very early adventurer in working with new technology. And yet new technology for Laurie has always been a way to mess up technology. I think her pleasure is really breaking it down and trying to kind of scratch it up and find ways to use it that we haven't thought of doing before. And obviously in current form, we're so used to looking at technology that's really gone through a very corporate aesthetic. This is still something she works with. So I thought just because, as an historian, I always feel I have to go back to the early days. I'm going to start with an early slide, just to remember what was going on in the early part of the last century, since we're right here in the early zeros. And we were constantly talking about the speed of everything changing so much and technology moving so fast. And I like to remember somehow what that speed was about in the early part of, now we've got to say, the last century. A wonderful Bugatti, this is around 1910, and was actually the possession of Marinetti, who, as you know, started the Futurist movement. This leads me really to talk a little about how we try to find an aesthetic to represent our particular moment. I know you have a graduate class show starting tomorrow, and I'm only sorry I won't be here to see it. Maybe I can do a tour, see what's up tonight. But just this idea of what each generation looks at to kind of ignite a new aesthetic, a new idea. And the futurists, of course, were the early performers. For those of you working in performance, they certainly took a stand against contemporary art of that time and against museums, and they called the museums cemeteries and said we've got to get all those rotting dead bodies out of there. They really believed that the only way to engage the audience was in kind of fairly frightful attacks on the audience very often, and came up in very, very inventive ways. Have you all been down to see the show of architecture, actually, down at the Geffen? I was just there this afternoon, and that was magical again to see that kind of futurism and what people were, certainly the early futurist buildings, and I just kept going past each of them saying, damn, why didn't they build that one? Damn, why didn't they build that one? What a world we'd be living in now. Anyway, so I thought the futurists were also quite extraordinary in the way they brought so many different media together, and in my view of the history of performance art in the 20th century as being that the most interesting moments in time are when different disciplines are kind of knocking heads. The futurist, Marinetti was very clever. He's kind of the first PR guy. He was there before everybody got into every artist got into having their own PR person in the 80s. He had a PR office working out of Turin, and he really believed in getting the message out about futurism. The other thing he did was literally gathered people from different disciplines. So Russolo, who wrote the Futurist Manifesto of Music, created an entire orchestra out of these noise machines. And the noises that were coming out of this were the noise of industrial society. One would sound like a train siren, another like a boat siren. So again, intriguing to think that this is a kind of precedent to Laurie Anderson. Actually, it's an interesting story because when my first performance book came out in '79, and Laurie had read it, and she said, damn, I thought I'd done that all before, I was the first person to do this. And in fact, she kind of went through the book and found all her favorite parts there. So again, just to keep as a reminder that there has been throughout the 20th century an interest in working in different media and playing with entirely different ways to explain. Well, not great in terms of an aesthetic, but this was the futurist idea of the machine aesthetic as revealed in performance. And in terms of sound, very interesting that both in terms of the graphics and this notion of sound as a form of performance, sound as something that you actually put into a space. This was actually a notation for a performance that Marinetti did in London. It was about the war in Adrianopolis, and it was all somehow about conjuring up the sounds of war in a performance environment. This is Hugo Ball. I'm sure you know the photograph, but do you know that this was early multiculturalism at work? He was interested in the sounds, or his imagined sounds, of what African poetry might sound like, and he had to be carried onto the stage wearing this little cardboard outfit, and he stood there sort of flapping his wings and saying, Gaji Biri Bimba. Now, if any of you are familiar with Talking Heads, do we have any Talking Heads? No Gaji Biri Bimba? Come on, it's the opening song on the first Talking Heads album, Gaji Biri Bimba. It's actually the Hugo Ball poem that he said while standing in this. And I can actually vouch for the fact, because Brian Eno was a friend at the time, and he said, we got that from your performance book. I said, good, purpose to all my hard work. So again, this notion of how we think of taking performance into the art world goes back so far, so many examples from the past that, in a sense, provide precedents for what Laurie really kind of took to a new dimension. We'll talk about that in the early 70s. Again, the early 70s, well, we'll talk about the Light. That was a wonderful film for those of you who saw the architecture show down at the Geffen. There's a marvelous film from the Bauhaus of Light. This notion, again, trying to work through all different kinds of media and see new ways of taking the aesthetic of a particular moment. So this is also from a Light sort of a theater piece that was done at the Bauhaus by the students. Again, how do you take art into live situations and experiment with entirely new technologies, new available ways of thinking about light and object making. This is a wonderful performance by Oskar Schlemmer called the Metal Dance, which was done by cutting out metal. And again, for those who are familiar with dance of the last 25 years or so, the Trisha Brown, Simone Forti, Lucinda Childs, the whole notion, Yvonne Rainer, finding natural movement, we're really going back to Mary Wigman, you're going back to Martha Graham, and what Schlemmer was doing at the Bauhaus was really trying to use dance once again to bridge a multidisciplinary idea. How do you take dance into the design studio and make designers think about space differently? How do you take dance into the metal studio? How does that then affect the way the dancer moves, i.e. for the dancer to come up with entirely new strategies of dance? So intriguingly, the Bauhaus was actually the first art school to have a theater, and that theater was used, again, as this nexus for bringing together students from all the different disciplines to actually investigate entirely new ways of creating a visual, spatial theater. Another wonderful piece of Schlemmer, a glass dance, a costume made entirely of glass. So again, you can imagine the kinds of movements that the dancers and non-dancers at the Bauhaus who were also involved with the theater program. But as you see, the design students, everybody would get involved. The glass-blowing students made the costumes. So a terrific way to get a school community really talking to one another. And really a very early multimedia work, you may know it, it's actually got a terrific story goes with it. It's a piece by Picabia that was done in 1924, so for the Swedish Ballet, and has a fabulous collaborative group. There's Picabia, there's Man Ray was involved with it, Duchamp was part of it. And the great thing here, again, was this notion of irritating the audience, trying to get the audience response. What happens is that everybody was actually given, as they came in, there were dark glasses on the chairs, and everybody actually put the sunglasses on because 2 minutes later, all these lights came up. And the idea was that it sort of blast this extraordinary light. At the end of the show, they actually come on in this little motorized car. And it's also one of the early performances that had a film in the middle of it. So this is from Ray Lush, is the name of the production. This is the film called Entr'acte, which was shown between the acts. And a sort of marvelous Dada surrealist film with, again, all our favorites from Duchamp to Man Ray and so on who were participating. And of course, jumping to the 60s, and there's so many examples, again, of people. Now we've talked a little bit about light, about sound, about space, how these different concerns were to really alter our perception, but also this idea of, as Namjoon Paik did, of taking musical instruments. We all think of him as the video master, but not to forget that his background actually is in Stockhausen and really avant-garde music of the kind of post-war era. And the playful way that he manipulates and comes up with absurd instruments, as in this wonderful cello piece with Charlotte Moorman, again, I think gives us a precedent for thinking about Laurie's early work, where truly she was such an inventor of wacky, eccentric sound makers and instruments and body instruments. Oops, just did a Laurie Anderson. That's a kind of typical Laurie, actually, just to give you an example of the way she works. She wouldn't just do this and apologize. She would turn it into a whole piece. And actually, the more I keep going, it's kind of interesting. She was also a very oral person, probably would have put it in her mouth and sucked on it, and then you get all these kind of new nuances. But can we have the first video? I'm still at early stages in my multimedia presentations. I'm hoping that I can find a student to come and work with me in New York and put all my lectures on tape, on CD, or on computer or something. I've got a G4, so it's easy, but I just don't know how to work it. So, it's just a nice holiday project. Somebody wants to come to New York, let me know. I've got a spare room. I can put you up for a week or two.
Ja nie idziemy na zwiądy, jako kontroli. I'll cut it off from there.
It's good, you shouldn't. You're being very bad if you do.
I'll cut it off.
Okay, I just actually want to show you, that's...
After I got to Boston, that I went into the anechoic chamber at Harvard University. Anybody who knows me knows this story. I am constantly telling it. Anyway, in that silent room, I heard two sounds, one high and one low. Afterward, I asked the engineer in charge why, if the room was so silent, I had heard two sounds. He said, "Describe them." I did. He said the high one was your nervous system in operation. The low one was your blood in circulation.
If we can let it run actually 2 more minutes, just to again give you a sense of a very 70s sensibility. Okay, we're going to take that down a little. Want some more? Note the palm tree. It's very 70s. But, you know, again, just to try to take you through this idea of how simple a lot of this early technology, how simple not only the technology, but the really desire of what these artists were doing to work with incredibly basic elements, clapping by Steve Reich, or this kind of minimalist orchestration of Phil Glass. And we can take this one off now. Thank you. Doesn't want to end it. Cut that? Thanks. Okay. This is actually Laura Jean's doing her Phil Glass, but it lasts for about 2 seconds. Just, you know, again, conjuring up some of that 70s idea that you worked with a lot of different artists, that people all worked together, just to make you feel really rotten, like you might have missed something. When I first got to New York, I had a 2,000 square foot loft for $200 a month. And that was Soho in the old days. And I think cheap rent was very much a part of the aesthetic that came out of the 70s. The fact that artists worked together would be totally typical to say, you know, can you come and work on my piece? And people really did do that. The fact that you could wander around Soho and there wasn't a store in sight, and just actually see other artists who were busy. And that you could go to performances and sit on the bare floor on a piece of foam and be very content, as opposed to, you know, more complex ways of presentation that we really have to think of nowadays. So again, early pieces to conjure up some of the very playful ways where Laurie began. Her own background, she was born in Chicago. She actually was an accomplished musician. She played with the Chicago Youth Orchestra. But in the 70s, you really hid any abilities that you had of that kind. The idea was to get back to a much more fundamental way of operating, so a kind of expertise was not appreciated. And so instead she poured water in her violin, she beat it up, she did all kinds of things to her violin as a way to really, in the early days, people didn't know that she was a musician. And it's really only after Superman that she starts to recognize that this is an area that she could go into. So the early work's very fragmented, very primitive, playful ways of dealing with sound, with words, with storytelling. She also made these marvelous instruments. Note the hair, by the way. This is the kind of art historian that you need, is to remember exactly when everybody cut their hair, which was early 79, January, actually. And Robert Longo cut his hair then too. When I first met him, he had a kind of Jesus Christ sort of long hair with long beard, and everyone was wearing Birkenstocks. Birkenstocks then were very different from Birkenstocks now. I just thought they were really silly. But everybody suddenly cut their hair. Cindy Sherman cut her hair. It was, the late 70s. It was, punk was reigning high, and CBGB's was the only place to be found. So there was Laurie creating these wonderful moments where, again, the playfulness, the inventiveness, the moving of ideas, shifting between instruments. In this case, she's put a little needle in the bow, and she can literally play sentences on because there's a little turntable built into the violin, and which also allowed her to, play along with the record or to take sections of the record. This is another, taking the same theme, but this time using a tape recorder. She actually puts tape in the bow and pre-records on that tape so that as she's playing, she could literally play sentences or stop sentences midway. So you'd kind of get these little talking performances, and sometimes there'd be just hundreds of different bows, so she could tell a story each time pulling the bow. And in performance, these were really quite magical because they were just so odd and so wonderful at the same time. You'd have there's just hundreds of these bows that have different tapes. In this case, it was sound effects. Sometimes they were sentences, sometimes aphorisms. One of her favorites was a phrase by Lenin saying, "Ethics is the aesthetics of the future." But as she played it, she always stopped before it got to future. So she would say, "Ethics is the aesthetics of the few," and things like that. So there was always this wonderful play on words, word games, really thinking art in a terrific way, thinking through so many ideas. And again, endless inventions, in this case, a neon violin, which I love the story she tells. Actually, when she played it, because it was all electrified, it would actually pick up CB radio while she was playing. Remember CB radio before internet, before cell phones? And so it would actually pick up CB radio, or actually the New York City police. And you'd kind of hear them chatting to each other in her concerts. All that kind of accident was something she actually liked to work with, which I think is very different for people now working in media, where everything's expected to be so perfect and rehearsed and timed, and there almost doesn't seem room for that kind of accident that I think was very much part of her early work. Another terrific piece here, which is this desk, which she built sound into the desk. And the way this piece came about was she was actually sitting one day at her typewriter in the old days when there were electric typewriters. And she sort of was getting very depressed because she couldn't find something to say, and she had her hands up to her ears. And as she did that, she realized she could hear the typewriter. And again, that's a typical way that Laurie kind of moves from an accident of, just everyday life into creating a piece. And so there's this wonderful piece where the sound is built into little spots in the table, and people have to sit there looking very depressed, their hands over their ears. And in fact, there's a wonderful 17th century poem about sound moving through you that you can hear parts of when you put your elbows on the holes. They're not holes, and just on these little marks. And many different inventions. In fact, that was one of the most interesting things of trying to put this book together, because Laurie does work in so many fields, and it was how to try to tell the story, to make sense of it without simplifying it too much, so that her kind of intriguing ways of moving through media could still be understood, because she doesn't think of separating any of them. She doesn't think, okay, this week I'm just going to write my songs, and next week I'm going to do the film, and the week later I'm going to, write the stories. They really all are completely integrated. And she told me once, we were talking about there's this marvelous song called Coolsville, that some of you, if you know Strange Angels, know that song. And she said that song, for example, came about because she'd seen this little snippet of film, and she just couldn't get the film out of her mind. So, and she didn't know how to use that film. She didn't know, there was no place for it. She'd actually chucked it out of her image making in the performances, but the film just kept coming, and she just kept playing the film over and over again until she came up with the song, so that the film could go back into the performance. So it wasn't, we tend to think of using, of illustrating a song, as we see in MTV, and finding an image to go with the song, but she was really working completely the other way around. And she talks actually a lot about the this visual rhythm, the eye of the rhythm, and almost trying to force people to think more about how the eye moves, because we respond much more quickly to sound. Another wonderful quote she has is, she says, in the end, we cry when we listen to music. She says, I've never stood in front of a painting and cried. It's that kind of emotion, that music, how music moves us, but somehow what she's trying to do in the visuals in her performances very often is kind of get you to read things with the kind of rhythm, the visual rhythm that she talks about. Again, different kinds of inventions. This was a big magnifying glass that she used in performance, actually an early performance in the mid-'80s, and she reused it again. If any of you saw Moby Dick, I know she was it was here at the Royce Theatre, I believe, using it again later in a kind of much more updated version, but still seeing that same instrument. She does reuse a lot of early material, which is very interesting as an art historian, to kind of try and track down a certain iconography that she uses. Headlights, things that she's done to her body. I think one of the comments that she talks about quite a lot in terms of technology is this need for there to be a physical connection, a contact, some ways that it fits the body. She hates this idea that we sit in front of this rectangle. She calls it the tyranny of the rectangle, and as most of you do, I'm sure, sit in front of computers all day, and we're at these little instruments that are sort of designed almost for people with nothing except fingers. And I think one day we're all going to de-evolve into little fingers, and sort of sit there. And so all her technology is really almost about being physical again, about being sensual, about how to kind of grab this damn machine and kind of force it into something, to do something else. Again, so you'll see things that she does that are kind of an insanity. This is one where she literally walked out over this on a diving board at the edge of the stage, wearing these dark glasses so she couldn't see a thing. But how the instruments, even technology is such a funny word in this context, because she makes it so primitive. Even when it's sophisticated, she unravels it and ties it up and ties it around her body and tries to kind of make herself into this electrified object, but at the same time, she sees it as a way of being kind of very sensual with the technology. Again, that was the thing I was saying, typically only Laurie could think of putting one of these things in her mouth, which is actually, now that I think of it, what this piece is about. It's really taking a mic, putting it in her mouth, and figuring that if she sucks on it and opens her mouth in a certain way, she's going to come up with an entirely different sound. It reminds me actually of the story of walking up into her loft one day, and, well, two things actually. She had this old piano at the front door, and invariably everybody who came up, if they were a good pianist, they played their favorite tune, and if they were bad, you just went plunk, 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 plunk. But again, that she found a way to use that in one of her recordings. Another time I walked in and she said, here, she had these two violin bows, and she said, take these. And I was like, okay, what am I meant to do? And she said, spin. And I just started spinning, and as I spun, this incredible sound came out of these, just somehow the violin bows moving through the air. And then seeing that sort of a few months later in performance was, again, an insight into this way that she finds accidents in how these things mesh and creates pieces out of them. Again, a similar kind of accident. She was playing around with a mic that was attached to a drum, and noticed that she had sort of put it over her shoulder. She was working on something, she threw it over her shoulder, and somehow as she moved, and sort of the whole thing went boom, and creates this drum suit out of that, where the entire suit is now wired, and so she just sort of literally taps her head, and this bang goes off, like, there's been an explosion, and so this whole dance is about boom, chick, chick, boom, and she becomes this live drum. And the most recent instrument that some of you saw Moby Dick is this talking stick. It's actually 6 foot long. It's packed with all kinds of extraordinary technology. It takes sort of almost a room full of computers to work it. It's a way of sampling music. It's actually quite difficult to realize what it's doing because it's so deceptive. It just looks like this pole. What it actually has is a sleeve over the pole, and she could move it up and down and play with it to kind of create a kind of music sampling. And again, for her, it's about being physical with the object, so she can dance with it. You can use it dramatically as a harpoon, as a stick to hit somebody over the head or whatever, but that there was this idea that she's again personalizing this technology in a very unusual way. And the song that really took her, I think we all know, or maybe you're probably a little generation later, but the whole discussion about high-low, I think has finally really been resolved. There is no high-low anymore. I think we've found a place where it's really such a mix. But Laurie really was so crucial in the early 80s for crossing over into mainstream with the song that really took her by surprise as well. It's an 8-minute song. It's not the song of which hit parade music is made. And yet this particular work made it into the British pop charts and became number 2. And there she was. She had just pressed a small group of records, and she gets this call from the BBC in London saying, we need 20,000 copies. And she's sitting there with this little box under her desk, and which actually led to her having to find somebody to tape it. This is the cover of the first album. And can we have the next bit of tape? This is actually the piece in performance as part of our Superman, and the tape you're going to see is the Warner Brothers version, so it's very cleaned up, very 80s. And that should be it. No. Let's go forward a little. This is not our Superman. Okay. No, this is not. I think it's on that sheet. This is Bill T. Jones for anybody who loves Bill T. Jones. Yeah. Thank you. The Kitchen in the late 70s. Bill T. Jones going very fast, and Arnie Zane.
Oh, John. Oh, Mom and Dad. Mom and Dad. Oh, Superman. Oh, John. Oh, Mom and Dad. Mom and Dad. Hi. I'm not home right now, but if you want to leave a message, just start talking at the sound of the tone. Hello? This is your mother. Are you there? Are you coming home? Hello? Is anybody home? Well, you don't know me, but I know you, and I've got a message to give to you. Here comes the plane.
So I presume all of you know that song, right? She went, as I say, Warner Brothers suddenly commissioned her for an 8-record deal, and really changed, I think, raised the bar, as they say, for artists in general about where an artist could go. I think it made a huge difference in the early 80s. On the one hand, you had Cindy Sherman's work that clearly seemed peculiarly accessible. And then you had Laurie doing this work that nobody could quite figure out why it did work so well. And certainly it wasn't a song that she had written with this intention of becoming a kind of music person or moving over into the celebrity, that kind of world. And I think in the early 80s it was still really quite remarkable what she was constructing with United States. She really made this 8-hour portrait of America. And I think actually Laurie's strength is her take on America. Possibly one of the few artists, I think we also tend to forget how deeply political her writing is, in the sense of always critiquing what's going on at the point in time. This whole take of United States, which is really about a culture in the throes or the beginnings of this huge technological revolution. And, you know, in a sense, moving from telephones to light. These are just images from the United States, which again, in terms of the book, I really try to stop the action a little bit, because when you actually go to a performance, as with Moby Dick, you're seeing so many images flashing past you all the time that it's actually hard to remember what you've seen. And it's intriguing to think how many images she has to make. Recently, I was talking to her about showing work more in a gallery, and you know, this idea of doing an exhibition, and she said, well, yes, but, you know, in a gallery I just have to come up with one good idea. In a performance I have to come up with 500, which also tells you about the way she likes to work. She felt more comfortable having to deal with the 500, not to lessen, of course, what it takes to come up with that one fantastic idea to fill a big space. Any gallery, I think, is a big space, but her reading of her own way of working is always on this many levels, and dealing with so many ideas coming at you that, in a sense, what I was trying to do with the book is slow them down so that you can actually start to realize what it is that you saw. I say the politics really is always there. You can literally go through her work and find a moment in time and just stop it at that moment and recognize that, you know, you're either dealing with the Reagan era in New York and homelessness and a tremendous sense of, again, where we're up to. The late 80s, she was lots of commentary about censorship and Jesse Helms and the way that the Gulf War was handled. Constant commentary, it's always there, it's always an underlying issue. There's a lot of awareness of kind of intellectual rumination. There's a tremendous sense of culture that she has that I think also is wonderfully, not disguised, but just so subtle that there's no pandering, that she can sing a song and that you come away humming it and you don't even realize that it's a song about Walter Benjamin or about, you know, Wittgenstein or about Fassbinder. So there's this terrific layering that she does, which in some ways answers that sort of difficult question of how does one cross over into the mainstream, and it doesn't necessarily mean simplifying to such a degree that, you know, you can't still work at that level. Again, just to show you some of the simple ways. Another really intriguing discussion I had with her at the time I was going through her archives and putting pictures together, and it's one of the pictures I put right in the front of the book. It's a very simple picture of her sitting in silhouette, and she said, that's my most favorite picture, and I thought, that's strange, why? And she said, well, because I really think that what my work is about is light. And I'm sure, you know, it really changed a whole way that I had to deal with the work, because it was like, well, I think of it as about sound, I think about music, I think about writing, I think about visuals, but just about light. And she went on to describe really that she feels that as she's moving on stage, that's her sort of strongest awareness of how she's altering light by being inside it, how she's using it as projection. And, you know, within that, you also try to find all these different bits of iconography. This is a pillow that comes up a lot in the pieces. Interestingly, she always refers to dreams and dreaming. There's a lot of dream material that she brings up constantly. Not so much interpretive, but storytelling. I mean, not psychoanalytic in a Freudian sense of dreaming, but really using dream as source material. Once she was staying with me, actually, in the country, and we were in this very old house with wobbly floors and plaid kind of quilts, and she came up the next morning and she said, "Gee, I had this dream." And I said, "What was it?" And she said, "Oh, I dreamt I was a troll doll in a farmer's pocket." And it was so bizarre. And of course, Lou says, "Hey, Laurie, that's really good. Say it twice. It's the beginning of a really good song." You know, I dreamt I was a troll doll. Anyway, but it then turns out that she said, "Yeah, and I have this potion for dreaming, which is salt and milk before bedtime." And so it's things like that that do come up in the book, because there's no way that I would have come up with that question and been able to say, well, how do you dream? You know, where do you get your source material? And clearly this is something that it really is part of where she finds, you know, more and more sources for her material. So again, as a historian, it was interesting putting this book together, because as a friend I had complete access to her archives, which I think is probably why no book's been written before. It's pretty intrusive to let somebody into your place like that. But as an art historian, I had to almost wrestle with her a bit to take certain pictures out of there and say, these are important, they tell us the way you think, what your kind of many layers of handwriting. In this case, this is a plug, an outlet that I think we have here too. Again, turning it into this alien, which appears in quite a lot of the early pieces. And I also try to talk about signing. I think communication is so important to her. Possibly one of the few artists. I mean, if you think of all your art history classes and how everybody first started out with, you know, the whole history of 20th century art is really about difficult art. It's about work that is not accessible. It's not obvious. It's something that you kind of really have to work at very often. And Laurie's position is, I have to communicate above all, that there isn't time for people to come back and look at the details. And that's also unusual, because I think in the history of performance art, in the history of 20th century art, there isn't that attempt to, maybe Matisse was the only one who said he wanted to make armchair art. He wanted to make art that kind of held you and made you kind of feel comfortable. I think we're so used to art that makes you feel uncomfortable. And again, I think Laurie, and sometimes people might feel to too great a degree or whatever, but that there's this real sense of talking to an audience or with an audience is a kind of, there's such an intensity to her about the way this material has to communicate. Just a couple of weeks ago we were doing a book reading somewhere and somebody said, well, who is your audience? And I was intrigued by her answer, which is probably a lot of our answers. She said, I think I am, meaning her. She said, you know, I'm in the front row and I want to be dazzled, I want to be surprised, I want to be, you know, altered, I want to have to think about things that I hadn't thought about before. And in that sense, I think it's a kind of wonderful mantra, probably for every artist, is that sense is that you want to be amazed by what you make. And this was an interesting sense. So again, just talking about the signage in a way that she uses, that again, she wouldn't think of these as important images, but because communication is such a key, and the fact that she does travel an enormous amount and shows work in Japan, shows work in, you know, Germany, France, Italy, she always tries to learn the language and uses a kind of common iconography. A wonderful story she tells about being in Japan, where somebody taught her phonetically how to say certain songs in Japanese, and then one of the sponsors had dinner with her that night and was chatting away with her, and he said, excuse me, but I don't understand. She said, what's up? And he said, well, when you speak English, you don't have a stammer, but when you speak Japanese, you have a terrible stammer. And she realized, or was told eventually, that the person who taught her Japanese had a very bad stammer. So she left it in. She thought it was a nice accent. So again, just this, what I call in a way her handwriting, these pictures that come out of the work. And this was actually a lecture I gave at Princeton for the architecture department, so I thought I'd pull out her kind of diagrams and sense of architecture. Again, just moving endlessly through her imagery, things that recur. The house, the home is very important to her. She grew up in a family of 8 children, where she says she really learned how to be a storyteller because that was demanded of the kids every night. Her mother ran the show like it was a little theater every night. Her mother made sure that everybody was part of it. So, and again, you're thinking in a performance there might be 1,500 slides going by in a night, or that also includes film and animation. So it's a lot of images to keep drawing, to keep dropping down in front of you. I'm just trying to see how we're doing with our video man. We got a few more minutes. I just wanted to show a little bit of the next one. We'll just do a bit with sound and a bit with the sound off. I really wanted to talk. It was interesting. I was showing this the other day to some students and just having a kind of their feedback about what this looked like in terms of an 80s aesthetic. I think in the mid-80s, why don't we just start it and then we'll take the sound down a bit. So I mean, I'd love your comments about how this holds up or not. Or
Paradise is exactly like where you are right now. Only much better. Sun's going to change, and they seem to have gotten stuck in one of those abstract chances. And who is going? And Fred says, I think he's in some kind of pain. I think it's a pain cry. And I said, pain cry. The language is a virus. Language, it's a virus. Language, it's a virus.
just take the sound down. I just want to put it about. What's interesting about this piece, again, you're just a decade later, but in the mid-80s, it was kind of, I hate to use the word, but sort of throw-up time for a lot of artists in response to the excess of the 80s. Cindy Sherman had these amazing, I don't know, sort of details where they're sort of regurgitated. And Cindy's comment was, at the time, was an idea and just to buy this. This is Laura's kind of response to the mid-80s, to the rocky culture. She very rarely worked on this level, this high level going into the mainstream. I think after this she did it to end of the 90s, she actually did this performance where she just came reduced down to one slide and electric piano and just went on the road giving lectures again, just talking about issues. And interestingly, this in regard to documentation, this is really what Sparrow is like. This is the only question in the film of the performance, which sadly, in a sense, the earlier work just doesn't exist on film. This is the only one which is made at this particular moment in the 80s, which I think is more about production. Less about the kind of pure invention that she was involved with.
It's a shipwreck. It's a job. You know, I don't believe there's such a thing as TV. I mean, they just keep showing the same.
Actually, we can go to the next one. I wanted to show you another video that she made, which was actually to... we can go forward. Yeah, I don't know how to turn this off. You
know, recently,
How do I turn it off?
a lot of
This
people
way?
have been talking about changing the national anthem to America the Beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, I don't know really if that's such a great idea. I mean, I really like the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, it is kind of hard to sing, though, with all those arpeggios, and you're out at the ballpark and the fans are singing away, and it's sort of pathetic, really, watching everybody try to hang on to that melody. The words are great, though. Just a lot of questions written during a fire. Things like, hey, do you see anything over there? I don't know, there's a lot of smoke. Say, isn't that a flag? Couldn't say, really. It's pretty early in the morning. Hey, do you smell something burning? I mean, that's the whole song. It is a big improvement, though, over most national anthems, which are in 4/4 time. You know, we're number one, this is the best place. I also like the B-side of the national anthem, Yankee Doodle. Truly a surrealist masterpiece. Yankee Doodle came to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. Now, if you can understand the words to this song, you can understand anything that's happening in the art world today.
That also tells you a lot about Laurie. That was meant to be her her ads for Strange Angels, which again I think is a kind of terrific way that she so ironically deals with this world that we live in, that instead of just doing straight commercials for the album, she decided to do something different, to try to come up with another form. So just to take you through some slides, different shows, again in a way to, I sort of try to pick from my collection some of the most seductively beautiful pictures that she makes, because I think after all she is a visual artist. She's making visual images that that really just basically never stop. They're up there on stage and we just forget how fast these things are going by and how each one really is a picture in itself. Interestingly, just when I thought I had said everything I had to say, Aperture magazine asked me to write something on her for their newly designed issue on photography, and I suddenly started thinking again about Laurie and photography and realized, well, that's very interesting. She has all these incredible photographs, but she doesn't really take them. On the other hand, she's setting the entire thing up, so she's in the photograph and the image is hers. What does that mean? And we ended up having a really terrific conversation about her sense of photography, and once again actually her final conclusion was it's just another way of using light. And so for the book, each time I really spent trying to find images that hadn't been used 100 times and ones that showed a range of picture making that really is the heart of what she does, of the many hearts of what she does. And just the last slides from Moby Dick. Again, you see those pillows, which were in a much earlier piece that was actually from the United States from 1981, 2, and 3. They're sort of back there, it's old friends. And just to tell you a few comments in a way about what it takes to try to put an artist into a book, to sort of put the genie back in the bottle. The book experience has been really extraordinary because in a way one had to separate all her different ways of making art. And I think for many of us, or many of you as artists probably work in many different media, it's really intriguing to try to bring all those streams together. And certainly as a writer, it's intriguing to how to separate them without simplifying it, because you don't want to make it too obvious about the way an artist is working. And certainly in Laurie's terms, there is nothing obvious. So the issue again was how to make a seductive book. The goal was for me to make one that you wanted to lick and hold and take to bed at night. And also to make a book that really showed her as somebody who, which I truly believe leads forward in terms of what she's doing with technology. I think we're too quick with each new generation, in a sense, new ways of working, to dismiss someone who's not sort of right there immediately in this new realm. But I think people aren't. I think what I hope the book will do is also show how early on she was there, what she has to say about technology. I think there's still a tremendous amount to learn. And in terms of bookmaking, my concern again was to make an object, a seductive object that talks about an artist who's moving forward into the 21st century. For any of you who make books, again, the concern here was to bring as much color to the front, because the 70s, of course, was all black and white. So that was really the way we opened the book, and really again taking note of things that were important to her. Even though I didn't really let her see the book till the very end, I felt there was enough that I knew about her. Another conversation with her once was about the importance of the audience. So I made sure that there's this picture there as a kind of almost symbolic introduction, like, you know, this is where Laurie feels her work begins and ends, is with the audience. And that was a last shot from Moby Dick. So I'm happy to take any questions, and we can have the lights up, and thank you very much. Or comments, actually, your comments about Laurie and where she fits into your lives as artists and the zeros. Yeah.
Hi. Can I ask just a very general question? So many of her productions, so especially the big productions of the 80s and so, they involve fairly complex collaboration with people, all kinds of people, musicians and Barry Oberman and others. I would be very curious about how you see the nature of collaboration in her work, and especially, actually it would be very interesting because you've done all this research, so especially the role of Harry Oberman and doing those music productions and some of the big performance productions.
I think absolutely. He's a big part of those early works. I think that Perry and Bob Bielecki, actually, I think, he's a sound engineer, and he helped build all those early pieces. He really built the first violins for her, in fact, just about everything, as well as this last instrument. He was involved with that. I think it's the technology. I think the way she works with people. A couple of those people have been very, very strong and important, and they're certainly credited, and I've tried to make sure that they're all in the book in a strong way. I think, like a lot of artists, she's also very much in control, and so I think it kind of moves back and forth, but, she probably initiates the idea. I think they work with her, as probably would happen in an architect's office or a lot of other settings where there's a lot of expertise coming. I think some of them were very important for inventing things, the way Bielecki and Perry Hoban. I mean, Hoban invented this thing that they call the duck's foot dissolve, which was a way to fold pictures into each other. So they're very truly there, and I think very important to the aesthetic of her work. And she also has tremendous loyalty to those people that work with her. I mean, she doesn't work with Perry so much anymore, but certainly Bielecki's in there. There's a group of people who stay with her very close, are very close to moving things forward. But in the end, it's also quite extraordinary, the range of what she does, just that she can conjure up everything from music to image making to film to these entire productions. It's kind of, the closer one gets to it, the more I was actually overwhelmed by the scale of how she has to operate. Not to mention raising funds and doing that side, which is pretty extraordinary in a situation that's not ever going to really bring in, be any kind of payback.
This is the kind of question about narrative, and going back to the early 1970s when other, say, dance or performance artists like Yvonne Rader or Joan Jonas, as well as Laurie Anderson, were formed in a context which you pointed to, first Futurists and then Cage, where the object of indeterminacy or randomness was really to evacuate any referentiality in work. So why do you think that it was so dramatic in terms of what women did at that point, that reinvested it through narrative with something that was messier, that involved kind of personal and social history? Is that anything that you...
Oh, I think all of that, yeah. I mean, I think it's intriguing that there was this whole area that Mary's referring to in a way of autobiography, too, of the early 70s, of so many of the artists, the women artists. I think that came out of the women's movement. I think it came out of consciousness raising, out of the whole dynamic of the women's movement. And I think it's intriguing that the direction in which she takes it, say, different from a Joan Jonas who kept it very fragmented and in a way didn't fully move into a narrative per se the way Laurie does. And Laurie's isn't a straight narrative either. I think there's one phenomenon actually that just changed the whole picture, and it's one of those qualities that you either have or you don't, which is stage presence. And I'm sure you've all been, or I don't know if anyone, either a concert of some kind, but when your eye is just riveted on one particular performer because of the way they hold themselves and carry themselves. And Laurie really introduced that element, which simply did not exist in performance before. I mean, if we think of the other people who are performing, the issue was never that central personality. If anything, I would say that Joan Jonas was as shy as can get and almost can't stand performing. And, would do performances almost to challenge herself to be in front of people, but there was no pleasure that she seemed to get about that classic sort of being on stage. Or Vito or Concha, other people doing performance in the 70s, they were really, again, working against this idea of the performer, the stage, of any kind of presence. And I think Laurie actually has an extraordinary presence as a performer. I'm going to leave my water. Is it back there somewhere? Do you mind somebody just passing me that bottle? Sorry, I'm just suddenly losing it. Thank you. My man. Okay. Thanks. Oops. I'm attached. Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? I'm happy to chat about. Yeah, you seem to know a lot about this. Do you have something you wanted to say? Yes, you.
Where she's from.
Where she's from? Chicago? Midwestern. She seems to say she's very Midwestern. In fact, this is the sea, but talks about the Midwestern sky as being very important. Her childhood is very Midwestern, Bible Belt, lots of Bible classes, enormous amount of information about the Bible and sort of... I think that the parts of her that are not heard or known about really is just how deeply that kind of sense of American culture is really built into the early work. A lot of the early work was actually, I think by the time she got to New York, she realized she sort of had to change that aspect. But there were a lot of early songs and stories that were about religion and so on. It's hard to be an artist and talk about religion at this kind of time of the year. And her family life of the 8 children and storytelling being such a huge part. In fact, her mother, she once told me, these are again the stories you sort of get sitting out on a Sunday afternoon in the summer heat, where she's told me that her mother used to dress them up. As a family, they'd go out kind of in these theatrical settings and show up at the local July 4th parade all dressed as horses and things, and they all had to kind of parade along. So obviously, I've met her mother, she's wonderful, and obviously this very theatrical mode that she had about the role of the mother and the role of children and sort of play acting in this crowd. So I think real ease with performing amongst people. And back to your idea even of the collaborative, I think Laurie is always surrounded by people. It's almost a way of, I don't want to get psychological here, but it is kind of somehow this notion of being with a big group. It's something she's always moved around with as a team of people. She's just, again, described her childhood as saying that there were always 10 people wherever they went, and that had this kind of real presence for her as a form to walk around in a group. Yeah.
He said somewhere in your survey performance that performance is the driving force behind any sort of avant-garde art movement in general. And I was wondering if you still felt that to be sort of the case, since pop culture is so enmeshed with high culture.
Right. Well, I think it's a good point. I certainly felt up until probably 10 years ago that was kind of one of those loose theories that I could hold to. In fact, in my first book, I actually went so far as to say I thought it was the avant-garde, that I felt that if we looked at the movements as we know them in the 20th century, futurism, Dada, surrealism, it was usually the earliest form. The place where that idea came from was in these wacky performances that people were doing. And that it was always work done by very young artists. It was done by artists sort of breaking, with, almost this classic idea of, you make progress by breaking with the last generation, and yet it was as though a lot of experimentation came out of that. I think up until the 70s, the fact that really was the case, I just felt it sort of came and went in waves. Suddenly, we have artists now who are performance artists and who don't shift from that. My other point was, in observing the history, was that artists moved out of performance because they didn't really like it. Vito Conci, didn't really like burning his hair and pulling his, doing all these bizarro things that he did to himself. It wasn't like fun in the sense of, well, fun's the wrong word, but it wasn't a pleasure for him to keep doing that. It was part of an experimentation. And then in a way he went on to make work that I think is still very much about a space being alive. It's very much about creating ways in which we move our bodies through a space. So it's very infected by that early sense of the importance of performance. But, Chris Burden, who's here, you took all the artists in the late 60s who were doing performance typically moved out of performance and sort of made surrogate performances. Dennis Oppenheim did performances in the beginning, and then he made little models of himself, and switched that around. Since, the kind of popularity, and probably Laurie's part of that too, but also Robert Wilson, also Meredith Monk, we now have sort of 25 years of artists who we just think of as working exclusively in performance. So while I still see it as a strange place where I still see it as something that will remain very important, because I think it's a place where things can happen very quickly and cause a lot of shifts. And even now, I think a lot of photography that we're looking at, whether it's Marika Mori, whether it's Crudson, all these people are coming out of, I'm not even going to use the word, or maybe I have to use the word, the performative. It's not one of my favorite words, but that's something else. But I think that there is indeed that element that I still think that work is so informed by what performance does for people. And Cindy Sherman came out of doing performances. Those early pieces she did were performances. I remember being at a party once, and this person showed up and was sort of 1978, I think we were at Matt Mullican's loft on Broome Street or something, and everybody's in their downtown scrappy look, and this strange kind of housewifey looking type comes in, and you suddenly realize, oh, it's Cindy, doing another one of her things, and she would just show up dressed as odd people, the people that eventually, are in her photographs. So her work really comes straight out of performance. I tend to still see it as a, hugely important way of making work that contains so much information. I think another reason a lot of people turn to performance, I just did a panel at the Kitchen a month or two ago with Shirin Nishat and with Tanya Bruguera, who's a very interesting Cuban artist, and kept asking each of them how they came to do the kind of work they did. And again, I think people use live work even as parts of the work, even if they don't stay in that area, because it's a way of putting so much more information into a piece than you can possibly do with a photograph or with any other media that we're using. It's a way of layering information, and sometimes people feel a real need to put a lot more information. Shirin Nishat's point was that her early photographs were taken so one-dimensionally in a way. She was being called this sort of political feminist activist in a sort of, in the culture that she lives in, and she felt it was too limited, so she started moving into film, again, as a way to expand the kinds of information she could include. And I think performance really takes that all the way. But as you say, there's, I wrote books about it, there are institutions, there are schools which didn't exist before. It has become a real academic form, although still puzzling, because I think it's still unnerving, because people don't quite know what to do with it. It's the argument that photographs should be banned, because if you weren't there, you don't know what it felt like. And my argument is that photographs allow us to actually contemplate what was going on at the time. And indeed, most of the time, very few people were there in the first place. Probably 20 people saw Chris Burden getting shot, but everybody knows the photograph. So many, many issues that come up that I think still keep us very alert and treat it as a form that is always going to be very surprising. But then I'm an optimist, so yeah.
Could you say actually a couple of words about the nature of your book? Let's say you spoke about this 25 years long friendship. So the issue about like adapting a critical point of view to the topic. So whether this is do you see this as like a critical study or like a sort of like official artistic?
Well, it's definitely not an official one. I think it's very much my point of view. It's not an official one in the sense that I think for me, because I write about performance, and this is the one, I've made it, my 25 years has been writing about people who work in many, many media. And possibly the closer I get to, the fact is that I had to look at work, some of it that maybe I wasn't, that if I were more, maybe the critic in me dropped a couple of things that are not in the book, which is the best way of being a critic in certain ways, that you edit out certain pieces that you don't think are as strong as others. It's an intriguing operation for the way I work as a writer. I tend not to, that's the whole thing about criticism, that I tend not to write about work that I really think doesn't work, because I just feel that there's a more constructive way to approach things. So it's really, I try to put when you have a chance to read the book, it's very much about putting her in the context of the time, of other artists that were working in sound, other artists that are working, that, she isn't this sort of miracle that exists on her own. She exists in a context. I think a lot of the work in the mid-'80s is very problematic, as she does. And I think that applies across the board I literally have a class at NYU where we just talk about the mid-'80s and look at all the awful pieces that came out of that. I'm beginning to think that the late 90s and early zeros are making the 80s look like quaint times as far as the way people are spending money and considering commodities and so on. In fact, I went to see American Psycho. I don't know how I did, but I did. And I came out thinking, why does this feel so familiar? God, this is bizarre. People obsessing about, the right print on their little note cards. And I realized it just feels like now, the same kinds of absurd obsessions with, making it in very different, very unappealing ways. But, so, no, it's not an official version, but it's one of, because I write about this area, I felt it was important to assess where I truly think she's been important and put her in that historical context. She didn't see it till the end either, which she took a big risk. But it's okay. We got the okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I know the end of your... Good. Thank you, dear. Disconnect.
That was a very informative, great talk. People wanted to just look at and listen to things longer.
I'm sure.